All right, here we are back again. It is still Wednesday, December 1st, and this is still the pension task force. And we've just come back from a lunch break. And I guess what we talked about before we left for lunch was having conversations at lunch to see if there were any suggestions that came out, and then spending about half an hour, maybe talking general conversation. Then going into, at 1:45, we have the room across the hall and this room set up for a breakout session. And then, so does anybody want to share anything that any epiphanies that came to them while they were eating their chicken sandwiches?
I wish we had thought to put in assumptions, behavioral assumptions on our portion, so we could have seen how that broke down without the lack of them. Just one little thought.
Yep.
Yeah, Molly, I agree that has potential, because if you look at the savings associated with Peter's idea, it can be a sizable piece of the solution, I think. So knowing how to structure that, I think would be very helpful. The 1% kind of cap. The other element that I know Andrew and I were chatting a little bit about at lunch was the idea of we put out some contribution structures, and they sort of get to an endpoint in a set fiscal year. And what we were contemplating was whether it made sense after those phased in levels get to where they are, that we include some sort of risk sharing component, in that if normal costs were to go up by some threshold, 5 or 10%, then those set contribution amounts would go up as well, so that the employees and the employer would kind of share in that future cost scenario. And they give the idea that also if they go down in the future, that there could be that happening. But a way to leverage that contribution side of the equation, to a greater extent.
Any other idea of sharing that you wanted to talk about as a large group? Andrew?
Just thinking about also the idea of how VSERS has that longevity clause that they put out there, tying that with the idea of the freeze, which we put on the VSERS side, and attaching that to try and incentivize people to elect the freeze, looking at how we might be able to structure that as a way to be a gain to the system. So I think that might just take a little bit of spitballing, but.
Other ideas? Yeah, Peter.
I just, and I've got a question of Chris, and I just want to remind us all, and I'm sorry for being the bottom line Bob in this, but I just want to remind everyone where we are, and in a manner of speaking, and talk about the question that I'm going to ask Chris which is a hard freeze to a pension, and you never want to hear those words as it pertains to a pension, but my wife's hospital went through that. The hospital where we live went through a freeze to their pension in Rutland. And so I just, it's something I don't want to ever get to here. But the 2 years, or this past year, the cost of the pension to the general fund went up just shy of $100 million. Let's round off and say $100 million. The funds that we used for that were one time. This is an ongoing cost that we used one-time money with. You could easily say that we didn't fund it in an ongoing manner. You can say we did not fund it in an ongoing manner. We found money hither, thither, or yon. And we applied it to the problem. We applied it, it's not a problem, but we applied it to the bill. Next year, that bill will remain. We've got to come up with $100 million plus whatever the additional is for the year. And we saw that when we got the reports in the month of October. They weren't all that much, but still, it was still more. And coming up with that $100 million of ongoing money this time, we will not be able to use one-time money again to backfill that bill. Plus the additional 20 million, it wasn't 20, but the additional, I don't know where it's going to come from. And then the bill will be more the following year. So in order for us to do our job, we've got to somehow reduce the pressure on the general fund that pays these bills. And that's the reason that we're here. And we've been asked to come up with a 25% to 100%. I don't think we're going to get to 100, but a 25% to some percent reduction of that bill ongoing to reduce some pressure. What would that help the general fund do? The general fund has for the past 2 years, applied a lot of money to the Vermont State Colleges. The Vermont State Colleges are turning around. They are working now on behalf of the learners in the state of Vermont to get them ready for the workforce. They are getting themselves to a point where they may actually become attractive to a lot of out-of-state students instead of 15% of their student body being out of state. Because they are going to meet the learners where they are, be it the hybrid instruction, the modality of instruction that is offered will meet what the learner is looking for. Without the money to do that, where are the Vermont State Colleges? I can tell you unequivocally and fact-based, they'd be closed. They were that close to having to close. And that's not just NVU and Castleton, that's also CCV. They're all tied together. So we cannot afford to lose institutions of higher learning in the state of Vermont, because we would then be the only state in the entire union that doesn't have them. So that doesn't work. You've also got childcare. We're all hearing during this pandemic that one of the reasons why people aren't going back to work is they can't find anybody to watch their child. We need to rework the childcare concept here in the state of Vermont so that families can feel like, I was a stay-at-home dad, so families can feel like they can go back to work, both of them. That's going to take money. Those are just two that I can come up with. But if all of those funds that we have at our disposal, and I'm already saying close to 120 million out of the 180 or so million that we're looking at next year, increase in the general fund. Remember, not all of that is ongoing. So if all of that goes to the pension obligation, and that is an obligation that we must pay, what's left to help the Vermont State Colleges? What's left to help childcare? That's the reason why we have got to do something in this group to make a dent. So I just want to, ask everyone to really dig down deep and to make sure that it's not just for you and your family's retirement, it's for that 27-year-old and their family's retirement, to make sure that the funds keep going, such that if the legislature, Chris, decides that the Vermont State Colleges and healthcare and all the other things that are out there, nurse scholarships, the critical occupation scholarship piece, which actually worked. We had enormous uptake for all of those scholarships, and we're actually putting money to work for individuals that want to stay and earn and learn in the state of Vermont. So if the other demands outstrip the ability for the general fund to be able to pay them, and all of a sudden decisions have to be made, it's entirely possible. When might a freeze occur, or either a hard freeze or a soft freeze, and please describe the difference between the two.
Sure. So for the record, Chris Roop, Joint Fiscal, I am not as well versed in the difference between the hard and soft as you probably are, Representative Fagan, but I think what in response to your question is, I think This, when we talk about a pension freeze, it's basically like whatever the benefits you've accrued up to this point, whatever service that is going to be what you get, and whatever service you continue to work is not going to increase your retirement benefit. I don't think there's a clear line in the sand that determines where that decision needs to be made. And I want to be really clear that the way I personally view this issue is that you've got several billions of dollars of assets and you're paying several hundred millions of dollars out in benefit payments every year. Is the system at risk in the near term of insolvency? I don't think that's the case. I view the challenge differently. And I think, I don't want to put words in the treasurer's mouth, but I think she said something in one of her testimonies that I think was really spot on and I agreed with, that the real threat to the viability of the system is when the bills to pay the ADAC and to pay the promises, for lack of a better word, the accrued benefits that the active and retired workforce has earned, is there no longer capacity or political support to continue making those payments. I think that is the point at which we definitely want to avoid getting to, that every system I think would want to avoid getting to. And I think what Representative Fagan mentioned is, he went through a list of a lot of the demands on the general fund. And the needs in this state far exceed the supply or the availability of funds to address those needs. Those pressures are only going to continue increasing. And to what extent relief can be made, particularly on the general fund, on pension obligations, not only allows the state to deal with a lot of those other very compelling needs, but also mitigates the risk of political support to support the system weakening in the future. So like if a system loses its support or people decide they want to sort of walk away, if you will, a freeze is one option. Another one is, people could make new plans for new hires that look drastically different than the current plans. And that could be something like a defined contribution or things like that, where the state has a sort of a pay-go obligation to fund the retirement benefits while somebody is working, but there's really no risk of an unfunded liability accruing down the road. So that's why that's a long-winded way of trying to answer that question. But the way I sort of view that risk is, is the system going to go broke, for lack of a better word? No, I don't think so. I think the issue we have is really, can we afford to maintain it? And will the system maintain its political support long-term, given all the other demands on limited resources?
And
I hope I answered your question.
You did, and certainly one of the two hospitals, I can tell you exactly what they were funded ratio when they decided to hard freeze their pension, and that was Mount Scottney Hospital in Windsor, and they hard froze it at over 70% valuation of the pension, and that occurred 10, 15 years ago. Rutland froze theirs in the late 80s, and I don't know what the valuation was at the time. So it is something that has occurred. I think that, and this is the last comment I'd like to make right now, but I think that if we demonstrate a good faith effort here and at least reach the bottom end, the low end, at least of our goal, 25 to 100, it will send a message to the legislature that, look, the employees are in this with us, the whole state, because that's what the legislature does. We represent the whole state. And so we're going to help. And that will take some of the pressure off and allow us to look at the other things too, which I mentioned, that really need really shepherding on the part of the legislature. So, thank you.
So I don't want to be a Debbie Downer here, but I think that your point that it's not going to collapse necessarily, but at what point do we lose support out there in the public to continue the system that we have? And I think that is really important. And John and I were on a meeting yesterday, and what we heard is that our fire departments and our rescue systems are collapsing all over the state. That we don't have fire departments in many places, and many places don't have medical transport anymore because because we can't support them. So I think that when those kinds of issues are going to continue to grow, those, and it's the support out there to continue the system in a sustainable way that I think we really need to pay attention to. So I didn't mean to be a Debbie Downer, or bottom Bob, but I think that's what you called yourself.
Sorry.
It's okay. I think you meant bottom line, Bob.
Bottom line, Bob, if I didn't say this, I meant to say bottom
Thank
line.
you, or
Bob.
bottom Bob. So I had, oh, Molly,
I'm just gonna say what I think you guys can probably all anticipate I'm going to say. I could take guesses. And I have to say it not because I think it is going to be the work of the committee, but because I believe that it could be the work of the committee. And that is returning to, my, very first thing in that first meeting we had about values. And I guess I can't unlearn that the state of Vermont has $500 million more in the hands of the wealthiest Vermonters since I've learned it. And so I totally hear you, and I have all those same concerns. I'm so concerned about fire and safety to hear you say that today. I'm deeply, deeply concerned, and I remember as a young parent the concerns with childcare. And I'm simultaneously holding knowledge that there are $500 million more than several years ago in the hands of wealthy Vermonters. And I know I've heard very clearly from a number of people here that that's not something the governor will sign, or that that's not something we're essentially collectively willing to look at. And I feel really deeply saddened about that because I see that reflected in our nation as well. And it makes me feel like democracy is falling to oligarchy. I'm just going to leave it at that. But I just have to say that in a values kind of way. Not that I feel like it's going to influence our work necessarily, but I need it on the table.
so I spent a lot of time at lunch conversing with myself about any thoughts that I had about this. And I still go back to the issue of, and it's a shared risk issue of, and I'm stuck on this, and if somebody can get me away from this, I would be very happy. But that about 20% of the unfunded liability is due to past underfunding, and that's clearly in the lap of the legislature. And the other 80% is due to return, the rate of return, and demographics, which is nobody's fault. They're there. The rate of return might have been the fault of the boards and the BPIC, but we can't really charge them. And the demographic information or changes is nobody's fault. So I keep going back to this 20% is clearly in the lap of the legislature. And 40% of the 100% should be in the lap of the legislature. I mean, it should be a shared risk. So, and then 40% should be in the lap of the beneficiary groups. And I don't know if that makes any sense to anybody, but I keep going back there. And I think that the first person who testified at the public hearing also, I can't remember what his name was, but Peter Booth, I think, talked about that. And so I keep going back there, and that's what my conversations with myself at noon led me to. So, yeah.
Here, I think I took your comments as, kind of inspiring us to, make sure we're doing our best work here. I guess just conceptually to me, I picture our task here as, really ensuring that the systems are sustainable over the long term. I get a little, it doesn't sit quite well with me when we talk about reducing obligations we've made to fund other things we'd like to fund. There are other ways to raise money. So that, I think we have a shared mission here, but I don't wanna, I don't think the promises we made to state employees can be a piggy bank for other things that are priorities.
So if I may, because I want to make sure that I'm not misleading you. The work that you've put forward here in the suggestion, excuse me, my hands are freezing. They're blocks of ice.
So maybe you were
Uh,
Dr. Strangelove or Dr. Strangelove. Sorry.
Heart medication is just, at any rate. The efforts that you've put forward are exactly what the state needs. And it doesn't reduce your benefits at all. It slows the growth of those benefits going forward in retirement to make sure that we'll be able to fund it and you'll be able to live with it. And so if you were thinking I was meaning something else, I was not. I was just saying that we've got to sharpen our pencils, roll up our sleeves and do the best we can.
And that's really what I took.
Without cutting the knees out from underneath somebody.
Madam Chair, if I may just, you said something that inspired me to come up and just make a few remarks about the unfunded liability. And
Good, because I very rarely inspire.
you're very inspirational. No, I think when we look at the unfunded liability, there are certain contributors that, so the OPEB and the historic underfunding. I think the treasurer illustrated that, that segment of the unfunded liability was due to a specific policy or an action or inaction or whatever. I would caution us all to not think about the growth in unfunded liability in terms of whose fault it is beyond that, because there are reasons that unfunded liability has accrued for a variety of reasons. A lot of it is the experience just doesn't always pan out the way we thought it would. And that is not always anybody's fault. A big part of it is also, we being the state, have made changes to assumptions over time that have led to the growth in the unfunded liability. That doesn't mean it was a bad thing to make those changes to assumptions. In many cases, those changes put the systems on a more conservative footing, small c conservative footing moving forward. It's not a good idea to have really rosy assumptions that you have no hope of meeting with your experience. So the fact that the trustee boards took action and, in response to the last experience study and adopted more conservative assumptions, I would describe that as a contributing factor to the unfunded liability. I wouldn't use the word fault because from an objective perspective, it was probably the right thing to do. It's a good idea to have assumptions that you're going to meet and not have assumptions that you're going to deviate from too wildly. And it all comes down to this sort of idea of right now, all the risk is borne by the state government or the taxpayers whenever we miss and the unfunded liability goes up. Are there strategies that can be employed to help mitigate the extent of that risk reoccurring in the future and sharing that risk with more than just the employer bearing it all? So I don't know the answer about what's the right percentage or anything else, but I think this is a really good conversation, but I would just challenge you all to think about, how do we make sure that we all collectively put these systems in a place where there's less risk of really wild increases in costs in the future? Because I think that's the type of thing that really threatens the long-term political support for maintaining a retirement system. There's only so many times that we can see massive year-over-year increases. So whatever we can do to try to mitigate that so the bad times are a little less bad can only be advantageous in the long run. And with that, I'll get off my soapbox.
No, you can stay there, both physically and literally.
I have a little reaction and I'm trying to not feel defensive. So I'm just going to say, I'm going to ask you guys to entertain a different lens than you may have looked at something in the past, because it hit me at lunch when I was talking to myself in a new way. And I was thinking about the COLA pieces with state employees, COLA pieces with the teachers. And for the first time ever, I don't know why, I realized that the teacher system paying 50%, only getting 50% of COLA is actually a risk sharing measure. And that's a new lens, like, I hadn't thought of it that way, and so I just ask you to entertain that possibility that that is a risk sharing right there, because every time COLA goes up 1%, the teachers take on half of that. And so I would love for that to be part of the discussion. I hear a little underlying message in here where like the numbers come back and some of the VSERS scenarios look like they do more than the VSTRs. And that's totally worth looking at, and I am, believe me. But I also do think that already in the system is a risk share that was created. I don't know if it was created in 2014 or if it's always been 50% of COLA. I don't know. But whenever it was created, that's already a risk share. So I just offer that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I would describe that as it's a sharing of inflationary risk. That's one of several risk factors that the pension plans experience. There's other forms, could be demographic risk, people are living longer than you think they would. Investment risk, the markets aren't panning out the way you assume. Risk takes lots of different shapes.
Right, and that's, I think, what either Andrew or Eric, I don't remember which of you referred to when we were sharing things that we had come up with around, was it you, Eric?
No, it was
Or
Eric.
Eric,
having all
maybe you can articulate it better than I, but that was sort of.
Yeah, no, Andrew and I had talked about it at lunch, but you're right, that if you're sharing in future projections of the normal cost, you're sharing a different types of risk for the plan. Longevity risk, demographic risk.
So are we ready to finish our post-lunch reflections? I remind us of that. Yes. So I will remind us that we have $150 million of one-time money that has been set aside. If we get to a goal of between 25 and 100% reduction, that if we don't get there, that 150 million will go someplace else. It will not go into the pension fund. That's the way the legislation was written, and that's the expectation, is that the structural changes will need to be made and any other changes to get to that goal in order to access the 150. I just need to remind us of that, because not only are there other monies that are at risk here, the 150 itself is. So we have two. Eric, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I just want to ask a clarifying question, Jeanette. So do you thinking about that $150 million as part of the solution? Because, I know there's elements in a bill related to the budget, but then the charge of Act 75 says something along the lines of identifying strategies to achieve these targets. The way you were thinking about it, are you thinking about that pot of one-time monies as being part of the strategies?
No, I think the understanding is that there have to be structural changes made that get us to the 25 to 100, somewhere in that range. That without the 150, the 150 will be added in then, but it's dependent on those structural changes. Because without the structural changes, we're going to be in the same situation next year. We won't have the 150 million additional next year. So the structural changes are the ones that have to get us to the goal. Yeah.
If I'm looking at Act 75, where do I find that section?
Oh, jeepers.
Yeah,
I don't know.
It's on the very top of page 21.
Page 21.
Section A, and I don't see the word structural in there. Can I read what it says?
Mhm.
Because I'd love you to the structural. It's that this is powers and duties, and it's talking about the task force shall make recommendations, blah, 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 and then it says A, developing and evaluating a range of strategies to lower the actuarially determined employer contributions and unfunded actuarially accrued liability based on actuarial value of assets in the state employees retirement system and the teacher retirement system by between 25 and 100% of the size of the increases from fiscal year 2021 to fiscal year 2022, as reported in the respective actuarial valuation and review for each retirement system dated June 30, 2021, maintaining the 2038 amortization date. And I said actuarial and amortization and actuarially correct every time. Very tough.
So I think that the key word there is strategies. And I think that the strategies meant us strategies for structural change. Because we could come up with a strategy for this year using the 150 that gets us, that moves us this year, but does nothing to change next year and the next year and the next year. So the strategies are to get us to a point where there will be ongoing change.
And so when you say strategy, in my mind, I'm hearing changes to contribution, changes to benefits, one-time revenue sources, or ongoing revenue sources. Do you include all those?
Not ongoing revenue sources.
So you see it only as related to the employee pieces of it.
I think it's strategies for the structural change of the pension plan itself. That, and then the additional, the money, I mean, there might be other revenue sources. I'm not saying there won't be,
Right.
but that would not be part of the strategy or the structural changes.
I don't
That's-
think that's not how I interpret. I think that's an interpretation, not a truth. So
Well-
can we talk about that interpretation a little
I
bit?
think that's the interpretation that we were given by our appropriations committees.
I've seen some of their heads shaking while I was speaking, so I'm just kind of curious of others' opinions and thoughts.
If I could, and I am not the most person in the room with most familiarity to discuss this, but as I recall, the conference process last year, there was debate over the use of structural reforms or strategies. And I thought strategies was the ultimate word choice to be a little bit more inclusive of the solutions that could be brought to bear on our task at hand. But if anyone has more information on that dynamic, I think it might be helpful.
I will admit, I can't even remember if I was on the conference committee. Was I? So I certainly don't remember at this point.
So I think we could probably mince words and debate this back and forth all day long. But I am mindful that the clock is ticking and that we need to be able to get to some scenarios that get us within that 25% to 100%. And then we can argue about whether the 150 million gets layered on after or before, or goes away altogether if you miss the 25% to 100 target. We can argue about those things until the cows come home, but the task that is before us is to figure out how to make adjustments that put this pension system on the path to sustainability. And I think the moment that we were taking here in this immediate post-lunch time, it was an opportunity for us to get out on the table any ideas that were shared during lunchtime. And I'm going to suggest that we break into our separate groups now so that if there are further explorations that either group wants to do with the actuaries, that we get that done and articulated today so that we can have that back in time for the final report. Today is the day that we have to be able to make an additional ask of the actuary if that's what we want to do. And so I think we've got one group that's slightly larger than the other because it's going to include troopers and state employees. So I'm going to suggest that that group stay here.
Yeah, I was gonna say the same thing, because then Corey could.
Because the other, Corey's going to be in that group. So Corey, you can just stay right on the link that you're on. And then the other group will relocate to room 9, which is
Room 9, and just
direct-
follow Mike.
Follow Mike, and Mike will get,
So getting clarification before we break, so we're saying reaching our 25 to 100% targets without adding in recurring revenue and one-time funds. That's what I heard.
Inherent
I know.
question in the minced words,
So,
like,
but-
it's a huge issue.
So that's what I'm saying. So
so I have said all along that in my political analysis, and you can take it for what it is, I've been in the legislature now for a number of years. My political analysis is that it is not realistic for us to expect that with a Republican governor, that we would ever come to a solution on the pension problem that involves raising a tax right now. We have more one-time money on the bottom line because of COVID economic factors. We as a task force might be able to ask for some more of that one-time money. None of that happens unless we get recommendations that get us within that 25% to 100%.
right,
So
getting
I'm just saying that we can,
clarification as
we
get ready
can
to break.
set aside the issues around whether it's more one-time money. I'm saying we got to find recommendations that get us to that target, and the time crunch is that we need to be able to ask the actuaries to revise some of the scenarios.
Right, so we don't include the one-time funds and we don't include recurring revenue. Is what I heard.
To get
Correct.
into that
Mhm.
target range,
Yeah.
that is correct, yeah.
I'm very confused about that, because right in Act 75, it talks about examining permanent and temporary revenue streams to fund the VSTRs and VSERs. And so I'm confused where we wouldn't take that into consideration.
So let me just back this out a little bit and take the sort of the devil's advocate, I'm just an ordinary taxpayer kind of question. What I hear you asking for is for there to be a new tax raised in order to fix an unsustainable pension system without, and you're asking for that money to be made part of the solution. And what I'm saying is we don't have a political reality that would allow us to raise new taxes right now. We need to put the pension system on a sustainable path and think about adding that 150 or other one-time revenue into the equation, not on raising a new tax.
And so what I'm hearing is that we're okay with employees having to put in more contributions, but we're not okay with asking the wealthiest Vermonters to put in more into contributions, that there's no consideration for that. But it is okay for state employees and teachers to have to pay more to the system.
So if the solution that we drive for in this pension task force includes raising a wealth tax, I think that will go into the round file and it will not be considered legislatively, because there is not a realistic path to success for a bill that calls for that, because we have a Republican governor who has repeatedly said that he will not raise new taxes.
And if we send to our members that you are responsible for all of this, we're going to have teachers and state employees completely abandoning the system.
I don't think
because
$150
politically,
million.
People don't want to put something out there that Phil Scott might not approve, when we've had federal tax cuts since 2017 that have saved Vermonters $500 million a year, we heard in testimony. The top 20% of earners, $350 million a year. And we're talking about trying to raise revenue. And we're hearing there's money out there that people have been getting each year being saved from these tax cuts. And I guess I just see some major confusion there and how we're going to be able to speak to our members.
So I don't, I do feel people should pay their fair taxes, and I think that, and I understand that people have benefited by the federal cuts. But if you look at it, we also have, I think it's 35% of our budget is borne by 2% of our taxpayers. So we're already, and I certainly am not defending wealthy people here. But we are also already one of the, I think it's 3 or 4 highest taxed states in the country. And I just had a conversation with a member of the Appropriations Committee the other day, and she said, I can give you a list of the people who are in that group, and every year some of them are moving. So I don't think we should. And I'm not trying to defend wealthy people here, but I am also saying that I have a constituent, and every time there's something that happens, if it's an article about the river and how we need to spend more money saving the Connecticut River, he sends me a note and said, tax the wealthy to save the Connecticut River. Then we hear that the libraries are underfunded, and he sends me a note that says, tax the wealthy to save the libraries. So there's, even if we did it, there's a lot of need out there for that. And I don't know what to say, but I think that we have to come up with some real structural changes here. And we're not just asking the employees to do it, because the General Assembly will be paying a large portion of it, and we're already paying. And that is the taxpayers of Vermont that are paying. So I don't think that
That's us paying twice. We are the taxpayers.
yes, I know.
And you want to increase our contributions and take away COLA and reduce benefits, and yeah, it's us twice.
And everybody else. I mean, I don't think we should argue about this, but we could just leave the system the way it is right now. We could,
And 150 million could go back into the general fund to be
Just-
used for libraries or the Connecticut
Right.
River or childcare or whatever.
so we don't have to make any structural changes. We can just leave everything as it is right now. And in 3 years, we'll be back here with the same problem, because it's unsustainable.
I just want to take a step back. I feel like we're getting into the weeds a little bit too much, and we have important work to do here. But I want to make sure we have the right foundation to do that. Act 75 on page 21, bullet point A, states are charged as developing and evaluating a range of strategies to lower the actual determined employer contributions and funded liability. It does not say structural changes. It says a range of strategies.
Okay.
And specified beneath there, it does say temporary and exist new revenue streams. Now, I kind of see the range of strategies as encompassing 4 buckets. One-time funds, revenue. It doesn't have to be revenue raised by a new tax, although the governor has supported a sports betting tax very publicly. Employer contributions and employee contributions, and the benefit structure itself. I felt like that was the 4 buckets we were working from, and I'm kind of hearing that those aren't the 4 buckets, and we're really dealing with employee contributions and the benefit structure.
So-
And that does not seem consistent with our charge.
So what I guess it comes down to in my mind is that if there weren't any structural changes made, the rate of growth of all of those new monies that would have to be put in order to keep the system afloat, because it is unsustainable right now, would outstrip any revenue source that we might put into it. Okay, so yes, we can talk about one-time money. Yes, we can talk about sports betting. All of those things will not grow at the rate of growth of the unfunded liability in our pension system unless we make some changes. And that's what I'm trying to focus us on here this afternoon, because we have now about 2 hours left in our day here today in order to make whatever decisions we want to make about the additional ask of the actuaries to do that part of the problem. The other stuff we can argue about when we're arguing about our final recommendations, but we're wasting time right now because we're not figuring out how to stem the bleeding in this system that no amount of new revenue is going to be able to fix unless we have it on a more sustainable path.
And I just add one thing to that, which is that we have model revenue, both one-time and recurring. So we already have those models. So we really, if we're gonna not waste any more time, we need to look at other things because we already have those existing models.
I think we can kind of agree that our task today is to flesh out the ask of the actuary. And to the way these different pieces make up the our ultimate recommendations, it does seem like maybe that's still a discussion that we can continue to have at future.
Okay,
So the smaller group, I believe, is Fagan, Petek, Stoner, Emmerich, McCann, and I'll ask Chris Roop to join them since he might be able to interpret some of the actuarial results from the two groups. And the other group is state employees and BTA here.
So did you say Corey?
Corey's going to stay here because he's right there.
Yeah.
He's going to stay right where.
I wondered if maybe he could bring his baby.
I was hoping he would actually bring the baby in person because that would be so much better for our.
She sat through the 11 to noon hour. She decided it was not that exciting. But if you notice, I've lost a layer because it was covered in what I was feeding her.
Yeah. These things happen. All right.
Okay. So Mike, I think, went over to the other room. It's right straight across the hall, what used to be the coat room.